ducts that are important for this discussion are called the seminiferous tubules. Okay, so it's a mesh-like or network structure of tubes in the testicle, and the immature sperm sit on a little compartment along the edge of those tubes, and as they mature, they move towards the center of those tubes, and then when they are mature enough, those sperm cells actually drop into the hollow of the tube and then can travel through those tubes to a structure that's along the side of the testicle called the epididymis. The epididymis, again, is a series of ducts. And then the epididymis converges with something called the vas deferens. Okay. I think in high school, we all remember this by thinking about it's the vas deferens. I don't know who came up with that. I think it was a young girl sitting to the left of me that was like, oh, it's like the vas deferens. I never forgot that. I don't know. Maybe it was the topic matter. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was some combination of the two. But in any case, the sperm go from the seminiferous tubules to the epididymis and then to the vas deferens and then are contained in the ejaculate along with seminal fluid. Now, the seminal fluid is the carrier fluid for the sperm themselves. This is important because it turns out that a lot of things that can both negatively or positively impact the quality of the sperm relates not just to the sperm cells themselves and the temperature of the environment that they were matured in, but also to the semen quality. For instance, if you are a heavy drinker, if you are a smoker, or if you are a regular user of cannabis, especially if you smoke cannabis or vape cannabis, you create a lot of reactive oxygen species that disrupt the chemistry of the seminal fluid, which disrupts the sperm cell. So it's not a direct action always on the sperm cell itself, although it can be. So for instance, in the form of smoked tobacco or cannabis, there are a lot of carcinogens and mutagens that actually mutate the DNA, can cause DNA fragmentation and debilitate sperm. But there are also a lot of things created by smoking in particular, regardless of what's being smoked, that can create elevated reactive oxygen species and disrupt the seminal fluid that the sperm are contained in the so-called ejaculate, the semen. Now, this will also become a relevant conversation later when we briefly talk about vasectomies. Vasectomies are literally a cutting of the vas deferens, which leads to a situation, provided the surgery was done correctly, where men can still achieve all the other aspects of intercourse. They can still achieve erection. They can still achieve orgasm. They can still ejaculate. But when they ejaculate, the seminal fluid is released, but there are no sperm contained within the seminal fluid. And it turns out that vasectomies are a very effective form of birth control. And they always check to see if zero sperm and confirm that zero sperm are being released in the ejaculate. They are reversible. That is, vasectomies are reversible, but not always. There are a subset of cases where it's not reversible, in which case if people still want to have children, you have to go in and actually surgically extract sperm from the testicles. But it's a process in which the vas deferens is altered or severed in a way that the sperm can't actually exit the testicle. They can get into the epididymis usually, but not into the vas deferens, and so on and so forth. So if you've ever wondered what a vasectomy is, that's what a vasectomy is. And I mention vasectomy now because it illustrates the difference between the seminal fluid, the semen, and the sperm that the semen contain. Okay, so 60 days to generate the sperm, another 2 weeks or so for the sperm to travel through the various ducts to the point where they can be contained in the ejaculate. Let's talk about the sperm cells themselves. The sperm cells, again, have these 23 pairs of single-strand chromosomes. They're haploid. They have either an X or a Y sex chromosome as the 23rd so-called sex chromosome. And as we all know, they have a head. That head tends to be oval in most cases. The head contains very important enzymes and proteins that are designed to fuse with the much larger egg and to actually take the membrane of the sperm cell and combine to actually mesh with the egg cell's membrane and then deliver the genetic contents to the egg cell, in other words, to fertilize the egg cell. Now, just behind the head is a region called the mid-region. That mid-region is a slightly thickened region. And here, of course, I'm talking about healthy sperm cell morphology. Morphology simply means shape. A mid-region, that mid-region has a bunch of things related to cell motility and to the forward progression of the cells. First of all, it is chock-a-block full of mitochondria. In fact, if you were to look just behind the head of the sperm, what you'd see is that it is completely surrounded by mitochondria. There are mitochondria elsewhere in the cell, but most of them are contained in this mid-region compartment just behind the head of the sperm. And that thick region is where the tail movement of the sperm, the flagellation back and forth, is actually generated from. Much like if you were to hold a rope, like a battle rope in the gym, and you were to, whip the battle rope, the whip at the one end of the rope is what allows for the sort of, let's just call it what it is, the curves in the rope, the oscillations, the rising and falling of the rope all the way out to the end, right? It is the force of the whip right at that end that you're, with the battle rope you're doing with your hand, and then with the sperm that is occurring just behind the head of the sperm, that is actually going to dictate how fast and how well that sperm can swim. And indeed, the sperm has to swim very far. How far? Well, on a relative scale, and again, these are estimations because they're going to be, how should we say? There will be differences in the distance from the head of the penis and where the ejaculation occurs to the cervix, depending on the relative size of the vaginal canal and the penis that delivers the ejaculate to the vaginal canal. But once the sperm arrive at the cervix, okay, which is at the back of the vaginal canal, just at the opening to the uterus, once the sperm arrive there, the distance from the cervix to the egg, of course, will vary depending on where that egg is in its ovulatory trajectory, its pathway, but it is akin, based, if you scale for size, to the distance between Los Angeles and San Francisco, which is many, many hundreds of miles. So those sperm have to swim very far. Now, of course, if the sperm are delivered in the vaginal canal somewhat further away, they will have further to go. If they're delivered right at the cervical opening, they will have less far to go. The very effective swimming sperm swim very fast. So they are able to accomplish that distance in just a few days. And this relates to a discussion that we will get into in a lot more detail later as to how often couples should have intercourse if they're trying to conceive. Many people might think, well, it's every day. However, the more frequent the ejaculation, the lower the concentration of sperm in each ejaculate. So this is not a discussion about how often to have intercourse depending to your preferences for pleasure or bonding or whatever reason. This is a discussion about how often to have intercourse in order to optimize the probability of fertilization of the egg. There's some general rules that, of course, come to mind, which is ejaculations close to ovulation, both before, during, or sometimes after, are obviously advantageous. But you will also hear OBGYNs and urologists suggesting intercourse every other day leading up to the day of ovulation, starting about 3 to 4 days out from the day of ovulation. So we got a little bit sidetracked, albeit I think appropriately so, and focusing on fertilization. But what we were talking about right up until the point of that is the anatomy of the sperm itself, which is the head, the mid-region that contains all those mitochondria, and then the tail. Now, what we haven't discussed is the actual generation of the sperm. So if you're a male or if you're a female, I think it's really important to understand how spermatogenesis works. Spermatogenesis works much in the same way that the generation and maturation of eggs work. Although, as I mentioned before, it's going to occur ongoing throughout the cycle of the male's life after puberty. We already talked about puberty, and I'll just cover this in 2 or 3 sentences as it relates to males, and it's essentially the same thing. The hypothalamus, up until the point of puberty, is providing suppression of the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone. Then some biological clock, which is still not clearly understood. It's probably not leptin coming from body fat. Again, unlike in the female, it's probably not leptin coming from body fat, but some other signal arrives to the hypothalamus, removes that inhibition, and GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, is now released onto the pituitary. A bunch of hormones are deployed from the pituitary as a consequence. The 2 most important ones for the context of this discussion are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone travel to the testes, And they're going to do two main things. One, they're going to trigger the production of testosterone.